December 17, 1944, 0530 hours, Honsfeld, Belgium. The Tiger tank's engine coughed, sputtered, then died. SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper slammed his fist against the turret hatch, the metallic clang echoing through the pre-dawn darkness. His driver, Unterscharführer Werner Vogel, tried again to start the 700-horsepower Maybach engine. Nothing. The fuel gauge read empty. Hauptscharführer Vogel called up from his compartment, his voice tight with controlled panic. "The reserve tank is also dry, Herr Obersturmbannführer." Peiper climbed down from his command tank, his boots crunching on frozen Belgian soil. Around him, the most powerful armored spearhead the Wehrmacht had assembled for Operation Wacht am Rhein, the Ardennes offensive, stood motionless. 67 tanks, 149 half-tracks, and nearly 5,000 of Germany's elite Waffen-SS troops, all paralyzed by empty fuel tanks. Through the morning mist, Peiper saw the abandoned American position ahead, Honsfeld, a critical supply point for the U.S. 99th Infantry Division. The Americans had fled so quickly that fires still burned in oil drums, coffee still steamed in metal cups, and, lined up as if offered by the god of war himself, stood rows upon rows of jerry cans, thousands of them the distinctive olive-drab American fuel containers. Peiper approached slowly, almost reverently. His adjutant, Hauptsturmführer Hans Gruber, pried open one can and sniffed. "High-octane gasoline, Herr Obersturmbannführer," he reported. Within moments, his men were frantically refueling. Peiper walked among the stockpile, counting. The numbers were staggering. 50,000 gallons, enough to fuel his entire Kampfgruppe for the push toward the Meuse River, enough to alter the course of the offensive. The Americans had abandoned in this single depot more fuel than most German divisions had received in half a year. Yet as Peiper watched his men pour American fuel into German tanks, a crushing realization settled over him like the morning fog. If the Americans could afford to abandon such quantities, if they could leave behind what Germany would guard with entire divisions, then the war was already lost. Germany had not merely miscalculated, it had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of its enemy. 6 months before Peiper's discovery at Honsfeld, in June 1944, Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments and War Production, had presented a report that should have ended all offensive operations immediately. Germany's synthetic fuel network, the lifeblood of the Wehrmacht, had been systematically destroyed by Allied bombing. The Leuna works, which had produced 175,000 tons of fuel in April, managed barely 5,000 tons by September. The hydrogenation plants at Pulitz, Bleckhammer, and Bruck were running at less than 10% capacity. The numbers foretold inevitable defeat. In 1944, the United States produced 1.8 billion barrels of crude oil. Germany, including synthetic output and captured Romanian fields, managed 33 million barrels, less than 2% of American production. The Third Reich was attempting to wage mechanized warfare with horse-drawn logistics, while America drowned its armies in petroleum abundance. Major Friedrich Zimmern of the Wehrmacht Logistics Command had calculated that the Ardennes offensive would require 4.5 million gallons of fuel to reach Antwerp. Hitler allocated 5 million, but only half was delivered owing to transport failures. The High Command was gambling the entire operation on capturing enemy supplies, a strategy that exposed terminal weakness rather than strength. The Americans, meanwhile, had built a petroleum pipeline system across France, Pluto, pipeline under the ocean, and the Red Ball Express, a massive truck convoy network delivering 12 to 500 tons of supplies daily to the front. By December 1944, U.S. forces in Europe were consuming 1.2 million gallons of fuel per day while receiving 1.4 million, accumulating reserves even while fighting. Peiper was no fool. At 29, he was one of the youngest regimental commanders in the Waffen-SS, holder of the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, and swords, a veteran of the Eastern Front where he had learned that in modern war, fuel was more precious than ammunition. His Kampfgruppe had been designated the Schwerpunkt, the decisive weight, of the entire Ardennes offensive. On December 14th, 2 days before the assault, Peiper attended the final briefing at Tondorf. General Sepp Dietrich, commanding the 6th SS Panzer Army, was blunt. "You will have enough fuel to reach the Meuse if you capture American supplies." The allocation for Kampfgruppe Peiper was 31,000 gallons, enough for 50 miles of combat operations. The distance to the Meuse was 65. Failure was built into the plan from the start. As the column prepared to advance on December 16th, Peiper issued strict orders. Tanks would move in single file to conserve fuel. Engines were to be shut down during any halt exceeding 5 minutes, and the capture of American fuel dumps held priority 1, above all tactical objectives. The contrast with American operations could not have been greater. That same morning, Captain James Rose of the U.S. 743rd Tank Battalion, stationed 20 miles from Peiper's start line, noted in his diary, "Received fuel resupply 8,000 gal. Third delivery this week. Storage tanks already full." December 16th, 1944. 8:05:30 hours. The German artillery barrage that opened Operation Wacht am Rhein used more ammunition in 2 hours than the Wehrmacht had allocated for entire operations earlier in the war. Yet even this display masked critical shortages. Peiper's column began moving at Otto 700, already behind schedule. The roads, which on German maps appeared as highways, proved narrow country lanes, many unpaved. Within hours, traffic jams developed as vehicles built for the Russian steppes struggled through the Ardennes forest. At Lanzerath, Peiper's first objective, they encountered unexpected resistance from a single American intelligence and reconnaissance platoon, 18 men who delayed the most powerful German armored column for nearly 10 hours. During that time, Peiper's vehicles sat idling, burning precious fuel. When they finally broke through and reached Honsfeld at dawn on December 17th, the column had covered 20 miles and consumed 40% of its supply. At that rate, they would run dry before halfway to the Meuse. The American supply point at Honsfeld was not even a major depot, merely a forward refueling site for the 99th Infantry Division, classified by the U.S. Army as a Class 3B depot, a temporary station. Yet what Peiper found there exceeded a German panzer division's monthly fuel allowance. Hauptsturmführer Hans Gruber later testified, "We found pyramids of jerry cans, each holding 5 gallons of gasoline, stacked 3 meters high and stretching perhaps 200 meters. The Americans had not even tried to destroy them." The captured fuel was high-octane aviation gasoline mixed with motor fuel of 80 octane or higher. German engines, especially the temperamental Maybachs of the Tiger tanks, were designed for 74-octane fuel. The American gasoline was actually too refined, causing mechanical issues in several vehicles. As Peiper's men refueled, more discoveries emerged. Sergeant Wilhelm Hoffmann found shipping manifests in the depot office. He could read English, having worked in his father's import business before the war. The documents showed the fuel's journey, from Texas to New York, across the Atlantic to Liverpool, then across the Channel to Normandy, and by truck 400 miles to Honsfeld, in barely 6 weeks. "I showed the papers to Obersturmbannführer Peiper," Hoffmann recalled in a 1976 interview. "He read them twice, then crushed them in his hand. He said nothing, but his face went pale. We both understood." Private Ernst Kara found a stack of Stars and Stripes newspapers dated December 15th, only 2 days old. The headline celebrated the opening of a new fuel pipeline from Cherbourg to Verdun, capable of delivering 300,000 gallons per day. One line providing more fuel daily than Kampfgruppe Peiper would consume in the entire offensive. To grasp the shock of Peiper's discovery, one must understand Germany's fuel crisis by late 1944. Since May, Allied bombing had cut synthetic production by 90%. The Luftwaffe was grounding aircraft for lack of aviation fuel. Pilot training had been slashed from 250 to 60 flight hours. The Kriegsmarine's surface fleet had ceased operations. U-boats used snorkels to conserve diesel. At home, private motoring had disappeared since 1942. Gasoline was so scarce that the Gestapo investigated black market theft of single liters. Farmers returned to horse-drawn plows. Meanwhile, the United States produced 67% of the world's oil. The East Texas field alone yielded more petroleum than all German-occupied Europe. American refineries ran at such a capacity that Standard Oil experimented with byproducts simply to use excess crude. The fires of Stavelot. With the 50,000 gallons captured at Honsfeld, Peiper's column surged forward. By noon on December 17th, they reached Bullingen, capturing additional American supplies, rations, ammunition, and, most importantly, maps showing other U.S. fuel depots across the sector. The maps revealed a sobering reality. The Americans had fuel everywhere. Every major crossroads hid a depot. The U.S. First Army alone possessed more than 3.5 million gallons in reserve. Peiper pressed on to Linneville, where his troops would soon commit the Malmedy massacre, killing 84 American prisoners of war. Even this atrocity had its roots in the same desperation. Peiper later claimed he could not spare fuel to transport captives. By evening, on December 17th, his spearhead reached Stavelot, site of a major American fuel installation holding over 2 million gallons. Here lay enough gasoline to guarantee a breakthrough to the Meuse. But as the first German vehicles approached, American engineers were already acting. Captain John Brewster of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion had received advance warning of the German advance. His orders were unambiguous: deny fuel to the enemy at all costs. The Stavelot depot contained precisely 289,000 gallons of gasoline in jerrycans stacked across 15 acres. At 16:30 hours on December 17th, as Peiper's vanguard neared, Brewster gave the order. Engineers poured fuel trails between stacks, distributed white phosphorus grenades, and ignited them. The explosion was immediate and tremendous. Technical Sergeant Paul Solis later recalled. A wall of fire rose 100 feet into the air. Within minutes, the entire depot was a furnace. Peiper A.S. lead tanks arrived to find a pillar of black smoke towering 1,000 feet into the sky. The inferno burned for 3 days, consuming enough fuel to power Peiper E.S. entire division to Antwerp and back. Unterscharführer Vogel described the scene. The Obersturmbannführer stood on his turret watching the flames. He said nothing for several minutes. Then he climbed down and said quietly, "They can afford to burn 2 million gallons to deny them to us. What are we doing here?" Across the Ardennes, American engineers followed the same doctrine. At Trois Ponts, 1.1 million gallons went up in flames. At Spa, 2.5 million more were destroyed. In total, U.S. forces deliberately burned more than 8 million gallons of fuel in the first week of the offensive, greater than Germany, CE's total allocation for Wacht am Rhein. This ability to destroy fuel so casually was rooted in a logistical system beyond German comprehension. The Red Ball Express alone had delivered 412,000 tons of supplies using 6,000 trucks operating day and night. Each truck consumed 40 gallons daily. The supply operation itself burned more fuel than German Army Group B received monthly. By December 1944, the Motor Transport Service employed 230 truck companies on color-coded routes, moving 20,000 tons of materiel daily, 3,000 tons of that fuel. Colonel James Snyder, Chief Logistics Officer for First Army, wrote on December 18th, "Fuel receipts yesterday, 1,847,000 gallons. Fuel issued, 1,623,000 gallons. Net gain to reserves, 224,000. The pipeline system was even more astonishing. Operation Pluto had laid pipelines across the English Channel, pumping 1 million gallons daily from Britain. Inland, the Cherbourg-Paris line delivered 800,000 gallons per day. As Peiper pushed deeper into Belgium on December 18th, the impossibility of the German position became undeniable. At Stoumont, they captured another depot. 5,000 gallons consumed within 3 hours of fighting. Tiger tanks averaged 2.5 gallons per mile in battle, Panthers 1.5. In the rugged Ardennes terrain, consumption rose by 40%. Hauptsturmführer Otto Dinger, maintenance officer of the 1st SS Panzer Regiment, recorded, "By noon on the 18th we had burned 67,000 gallons since the offensive began. We had captured perhaps 55,000. We were operating at a deficit." The Americans, reading German communications through ultra-intercepts, knew of Peiper's predicament. General Courtney Hodges ordered, "Enemy critically short of fuel. Destroy all gasoline stocks threatened by capture." That same day, American C-47 transports flew 316 sorties to Bastogne, delivering 160,000 gallons of fuel, more than Peiper's entire Kampfgruppe possessed. The Americans were airlifting more fuel to a surrounded garrison than Germany's Spearhead carried for its entire advance. By December 19th, as Peiper's men clashed with defenders at Stoumont, the fuel crisis became critical. Tanks were abandoned not from combat damage but from empty tanks. Peiper consolidated what remained, perhaps 8,000 gallons, enough for one action or one retreat, but not both. Meanwhile, Allied planners looked beyond the immediate battle. Brigadier General Morris Gilland requested 245 million gallons for January operations. The requisition was approved without debate. The contrast extended beyond mere quantity. American vehicles were standardized for efficiency. The Sherman tank consumed 0.8 gallons per mile compared with the Tiger's 2.5. American trucks averaged 8 miles per gallon even when fully loaded. Spare parts were interchangeable. Maintenance straightforward. German forces, by contrast, operated a bewildering variety of equipment. Captured French and Soviet vehicles mingled with German designs, each demanding different fuels, oils, and parts. Every variation multiplied logistical chaos. On December 20th, Peiper received a radio message. "Fuel convoy destroyed by Allied aircraft. No resupply possible. Continue with available resources." He called his officers together. Sturmbannführer Werner Peutschke, his operations chief, was blunt. "We have fuel for 20 kilometers, no more. The Meuse is 30 away." According to Gruber's later testimony, Peiper replied, "Gentlemen, we are fighting an enemy who burns more fuel to deny it to us than we received for the entire operation. What we captured at Honsfeld, which seemed miraculous, means nothing to them. We cannot win." That understanding spread quickly. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding 5th Panzer Army, later wrote, "When I learned the Americans had destroyed 8 million gallons rather than risk capture, I knew the offensive had failed before it began." Colonel Friedrich von Donden, captured December 23rd, told his interrogators, "Your soldiers throw away chocolate. My men haven't seen chocolate in 2 years. You burn millions of gallons. We measure by the liter. How can we fight such abundance?" By December 21st, Peiper's column was surrounded near L'Église, his tanks immobile. The American units encircling him, the 30th Infantry Division, 82nd Airborne, and 3rd Armored, had a combined daily fuel allocation of 340,000 gallons. Peiper had perhaps 1,000. Private First Class Richard McKinney wrote home, "We've got Germans surrounded who ran out of gas. Our captain jokes we use more fuel heating coffee than they have for tanks." The American response demonstrated industrial warfare at its peak. Patton A.S. 3rd Army pivot north toward Bastogne required 350,000 gallons simply for redeployment, an operation German commanders would have deemed impossible, accomplished by the Americans in 3 days. On December 23rd, clear weather returned. Allied aircraft flew more than 2,000 sorties, each burning fuel at rates that would have grounded the Luftwaffe for weeks. P-47 Thunderbolts consumed 300 gallons per hour, B-26 bombers 200. One day of Allied air operations used more fuel than Germany had allocated for the entire Ardennes offensive. That night, December 23-24th, Peiper ordered his men to abandon their vehicles and escape on foot. Of 119 tanks and assault guns that had started the operation, 39 remained, but immobile. The crews destroyed them with remaining ammunition. Oberreiter Heinz Gohl described, "We drained the last fuel from all vehicles, maybe 200 gallons total. The Obersturmbannführer personally blew up his command tank. Millions of Reichsmarks of steel rendered useless by empty fuel tanks." Of the 5,000 men who began with Kampfgruppe Peiper, roughly 770 returned. They had advanced 60 miles, captured several depots, and discovered the truth about Allied logistics. The engine of victory. The destruction of Kampfgruppe. Peiper reverberated far beyond the Ardennes. In Berlin, Albert Speer received the first detailed reports on December 26th. His private secretary, Rudolf Wolters, noted in his diary, "The offensive has stalled. Peiper's tanks reached L'Église and then ran out of fuel. The Americans destroyed millions of gallons." Speer says this demonstrates the futility of further mechanized operations. Speer understood what the generals refused to admit. The Third Reich was no longer a modern industrial power. It was fighting a 20th century war with the energy resources of the 19th. By the end of 1944, Germany's entire national stockpile of motor fuel was less than 200,000 tons, barely 3 days of American consumption. Allied bombing had crippled the hydrogenation plants, and crude oil imports from Hungary and Austria could not compensate. The Luftwaffe received only 4,000 tons of aviation fuel in December, compared to 180,000 for the U.S. 8th Air Force. Hitler, however, refused to face the arithmetic. When Speer presented the figures on December 28th, the Führer waved them aside. "We captured large fuel stocks at Honsfeld and Billingen," he said. "This will continue." Speer replied quietly, "Mein Führer, those stocks lasted 3 days." No further offensive was proposed after that meeting. The disparity in fuel production was only one facet of a far larger industrial imbalance. Petroleum was the foundation of this abundance. It powered machines, transported food, forged steel, and moved armies. By mid-1944, U.S. refineries processed over 6 million barrels of crude per day. More than 500,000 tank cars shuttled fuel across North America, while convoys of Liberty ships carried refined products to Europe, Africa, and the Pacific. German industry, strangled by blockade and bombing, could not even move coal efficiently to its factories. Railway transport consumed precious synthetic fuel. Power plants reverted to low-grade lignite. The Wirtschaftsstab. West, Economic Staff West, reported in November that 60% of trucks in occupied France were immobile for lack of tires or gasoline. The same month, the American Quartermaster Corps issued a directive warning against excessive wastage. Commanders will ensure drivers do not idle engines unnecessarily, it read. Excess consumption has reached 7% above standard. That 7% wastage exceeded the Wehrmacht's entire monthly fuel allocation. The lessons of the Ardennes were studied carefully by both sides. For the Allies, it proved the supremacy of logistics over tactics. For the Germans, it revealed the final bankruptcy of their war economy. General Alfred Jodl wrote in his war diary on January 2, 1945, "Fuel, the decisive factor. Without it, the most courageous soldiers and finest tanks are worthless. We have entered the final phase of paralysis." By early January, German armies were immobilized. The Western Front consumed 3,500 tons of fuel per day, barely half of what was needed. Divisions resorted to using captured American jeeps and trucks until their tanks ran dry. Speer toured the Ruhr industrial region later that month. What he saw confirmed Peiper's battlefield realization. Refineries lay in ruins. rail lines shattered, storage tanks empty. Workers collected wood to heat factories. In Essen, synthetic plants operated at 5% capacity. The industrial empire that had once promised a 1,000-year Reich was collapsing in a few months of energy starvation. Meanwhile, Allied operations expanded effortlessly. Patton's Third Army advanced toward the Saar, supported by unbroken lines of supply. Every day, tankers poured through Antwerp, each carrying 140,000 barrels of fuel. The American pipeline system reached 1,200 miles, extending from the Channel ports to the German frontier. On January 15, 1945, General Dwight D. Eisenhower briefed his staff. "The enemy is exhausted. Their armored formations are immobile for lack of gasoline. We will exploit that weakness." The 4th Armored Division received 200,000 gallons that same evening, more than an entire German Army group. American soldiers joked that their tanks ran on Texas, while the Luftwaffe ran on fumes. The strategic significance of petroleum was now absolute. Every major offensive, every supply operation, every aircraft sortie depended on it. In February, as German resistance crumbled, Speer confided to Wolters, "If the Ardennes taught us anything, it is that modern war is a contest of fuel. The nation with oil controls the tempo, the distance, the sky, and the future." That truth had already been understood across the Atlantic. In August 1944, U.S. Senator Harry Truman had remarked during hearings on war production, "This is a war of engines and octane. You can't fight a mechanized war without gasoline." The U.S. petroleum industry had been mobilized as thoroughly as the Army. The War Production Board coordinated 200 refineries, 2,000 chemical plants, and 75,000 miles of pipeline. The Big Inch and Little Big Inch pipelines carried crude and refined products from Texas to the East Coast, delivering over 300,000 barrels per day. By contrast, German fuel had to travel 1,200 miles by rail from Romania, vulnerable to every Allied bomber. By March 1945, as the Allies crossed the Rhine, fuel shortages paralyzed the German war machine. Of 1,200 remaining tanks in the West, fewer than 500 could move. The rest were dug in as static defenses, turned into bunkers for lack of gasoline. American forces consumed 12 million gallons daily in the final drive into Germany, 20 times the total German supply. The U.S. Navy's single Pacific Fleet used more petroleum per month than the entire Axis combined. When Hitler committed suicide on April 30, 1945, German reserves held less than 2 days' worth of motor fuel. The Reich that had once dreamed of the world conquest ended not with a battle for Berlin-Ennes skies, but with empty fuel tanks on its roads. The legacy of fuel and fire. The collapse of the Third Reich in 1945 was not only military, it was energetic. The ruins of the Ardennes were a testimony written in steel and smoke. The age of mechanized warfare belonged to those who could feed the engine. In the immediate aftermath, Allied investigators studied the German war economy with clinical detail. The U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey reported, "The decisive factor in the defeat of German armed forces was the destruction of the oil industry. Once fuel production ceased, military mobility ended. No alternative existed." Albert Speer, interrogated in May 1945, told his captors, "The bombing of synthetic fuel plants decided the war. When Luna and Bleckhammer were lost, our tanks could not move, our aircraft could not fly, and our armies could not retreat." At Nuremberg, he elaborated further. The German soldier was not defeated in courage or training, but in energy. The modern battlefield is powered by oil. Without it, the finest army is a corpse of iron. Joachim Peiper survived the war, though not unscarred. Captured in May 1945, he was tried and convicted for war crimes committed during the Ardennes offensive. Sentenced to death in 1946, his sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment. Released in 1956, he lived quietly in Travées, France, translating technical manuals and working as an automobile salesman. Visitors described him as courteous but distant. He rarely spoke of the war, yet when he did, one theme recurred. In 1960, a journalist from Der Spiegel asked him what he remembered most about the Ardennes. Peiper answered after a long silence. "Not the fighting. The silence of our engines when the fuel was gone. That silence was the sound of Germany's defeat." In 1976, Peiper was murdered at his home, which was set on fire by unknown assailants. Among the ashes, investigators found the remains of his wartime documents. A single page survived, half-burned, with one legible sentence in his handwriting. "The army that controls fuel controls history." The lessons of that winter were absorbed by every military planner who came after. During the Cold War, both NATO and the Warsaw Pact structured entire strategies around fuel logistics. The U.S. Army's European Command maintained 4,500 miles of underground pipelines, with depots capable of supporting continuous mechanized operations for 6 months. The Soviet Union, recognizing the same truth, built vast petroleum reserves along its western frontier. By the 1970s, each side could sustain movement not by courage or manpower, but by tonnage of refined fuel per day. In every subsequent conflict, Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf, the ghosts of Honsfeld and Stavelot lingered. Tanks, aircraft, and trucks became ever more sophisticated, yet all shared the same weakness. Fuel remained the bloodstream of war. Historians later described the Battle of the Bulge as Hitler's last gamble. But in truth, it was the last attempt by any power to wage a modern campaign without assured fuel supremacy. What began as a bold counteroffensive ended as a study in industrial arithmetic. The figures tell the story better than any testimony. Fuel captured by Peiper at Honsfeld. 50,000 gallons. Fuel destroyed by Americans in the Ardennes. Over 8,000 gallons. Fuel consumed daily by Allied forces in Europe. 7,000 to 500,000 gallons. German National Fuel Reserve, December 1944. 5,700,000 gallons, numbers that spelled the end of an empire. Albert Speer reflected in his post-war memoirs, "The war was lost the moment America entered because we had no oil. Everything that followed was illusion. The tanks at Honsfeld, the flames at Stavelot, those were the last sparks of a nation burning its own future." By the spring of 1945, the roads of Europe were littered with wrecks. Armored corpses of steel, each a monument to the vanished fuel that once gave them life. The Reich had fallen, not because its soldiers lacked bravery, but because its engines ran dry. From the smoldering villages of the Ardennes to the refineries of Texas, a single equation had determined the outcome. Industrial power equals fuel supply, and fuel supply equals victory. The Americans understood this, and their opponents learned it too late. In the silence after the guns ceased, the words of an American mechanic at Spa seemed to capture the essence of the modern age. The war ran on gasoline. When theirs was gone, the war was over. Epilogue. Today, the rusted remains of Peiper S-tanks still lie scattered in the Ardennes forests, twisted steel consumed by moss and time. Tourists walk among them without realizing that beneath each wreck lies the unspoken history of the 20th century, the triumph of logistics over valor, of fuel over fury. From the burning depots at Stavelot to the idle engines at L'Église, the message endures. Power in the modern world is measured not in divisions or doctrines, but in barrels. And as Peiper once wrote in his final charred note, "He who commands the fuel commands the war."